Hello everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host Dan. Today is February the 26th, and the transit that I have in my mind today is Venus in Aries stationing retrograde, which happens to be in a sextile aspect to Jupiter in Gemini. Now, the thing about this, first of all, let's say that I'm not just looking at this in isolation, separate from all the other transits, all the other things going on, because, for one thing, the big transit of the year is this one where Saturn is going to conjoin with Neptune and ingress into Aries, and this area that Venus is having its retrograde, which is the first decan of Aries, this is the place where the Saturn and Neptune conjunction is going to be taking place. So the part of the zodiac that's relevant to this is the part of the zodiac that's relevant to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And what's interesting is that after this whole process of Venus retrograding, going back into Pisces, going forward, is mixed up with the whole movement of these other planets into Aries. So we're not just talking. So in some way, that we're not just talking about Venus retrograde here, but Aries, right? And Aries also. Last year we had the North Node in Aries, and we had solar eclipses in Aries. Prior to that, we had Jupiter in Aries, and it's one of these things where Aries is Aries is a particular zodiac sign which has been getting a lot of action recently with these transits, obviously, right? And so there's a kind of anticipation about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. There's also, if you think about this, the timing of it, I kind of alluded to this in some of my other videos. There's some loud music out there. Well, whatever. We'll just have to deal with this in the background. I guess I should also say that while I'm recording this video, today I am going in for an appointment to get this medical treatment done. And one of the things that I'm pretty open about this in my astrology channels, that I am on disability for a mental health condition. And part of what this mental health condition is basically, like, there is a whole, when you're talking about like mental health in terms of psychosis, there's a whole realm of experience that normal people don't experience, that generally is described as like a hallucination or a delusion, or it's called like a positive symptom in terms of just the experience of something there that other people don't experience, right? And the other part of it is that apparently there's like a difference between schizoaffective and schizophrenia, where the schizophrenic is typically is known to have a flat affect, right? Which means that the schizophrenic is typically shut down emotionally, is typically non-expressive of emotion, and in contrast with that, the schizoaffective is defined as being more moody, more emotional, and more expressive, right? And the whole idea around, so it's kind of like schizophrenia, but with this whole thing about a mood disorder, and bipolar is also kind of like this mood disorder where you go, it's defined by these sort of swings between feeling shut down, depressed, versus manic, and all riled up, basically, right? So, the thing about this is that I personally, my own choices around this is that I don't use medication to treat these particular conditions, but I am on a medication that's for anti-inflammation, basically, right? And what's interesting is that I notice there's a pattern whenever I go in for this. I'm for some reason I'm more moody on the day that I go in for this medication than on days when I don't, right? It's so there's this sort of thing about the feeling of moodiness, and and also this thing. I mean, I don't want to give away what Aries is for my in terms of house placement for my astrology, so I'm not going to do that part of it, right? In none of the ways, I figured I'd instead of, after I get this medication treatment done, I'm in a very different state of mind, right? And other things to consider around this is that I'm a Canadian. I live in British Columbia, and there's this weird thing where it's like my disability is set up so that I'm on a disability benefit for mental health, and that covers this medical treatment that is for a completely different kind of condition. But this is just the strange bureaucracy of how they handle the paperwork. I'm not really that, fussed with that, right? There's something about the question about, so like there's certain things going on from like a medical context. There's also a certain kind of like family drama going on where I just recently found out about my uncle passing away, but I'm not going to focus too much on that. I noticed that in the video where I mentioned that, I got one dislike, which is I'm assuming it's because there are a lot of a lot of wars and a lot of death and a lot of bad things in the world, and nobody cares about whether or not my relatives or my family members are passing away, right? They don't want to hear about this kind of stuff, right? So there's this kind of thing about like the different levels to approach this at, whether this is like personal medical stuff, personal family stuff, or else these more collective political issues that affect all of us. And one of these, the main one, is the trade war, obviously, right? And the trade war, for those who have been paying attention, hasn't started yet. And I made a video talking about the trade war, how it's set to basically begin at the beginning of March. And it's just interesting because when the trade war was originally supposed to start, the planet Venus was conjunct Neptune in Pisces. And now the trade war has been postponed and is set to start where Venus is about to station retrograde in Aries. And that this Venus retrograde will carry us through to where we have this Saturn Neptune conjunction. And the thing about this is that I was recently watching a video from a guy named Michael Meade, who is, if anybody's familiar with Michael Meade, he got big in the mythopoetic men's movement alongside the likes of James Hillman, Robert Bly. He would often do events with those guys. And so Michael Meade, most of these guys from the mythopoetic men's movement are now dead, but Michael Meade is still doing videos and putting on seminars and stuff like that. I noticed that Michael Meade had done a video recently where he was talking about Donald Trump and the problem with Trump in terms of this problem about being inauthentic, right? Which I thought was an interesting way to approach it, because I mean, obviously, there's so many problems with what's going on right now, and whether the question of inauthenticity kind of seems like it's just kind of part of the whole parcel, and and it's also interesting because I have to admit that in the process of making these video blogs, at one point in time I made a video about this whole question of authenticity and comparing the approaches to dealing with this problem from, there's like a local guy named Gabor Mate who is a doctor who deals with addiction, and he talks about like like how addiction is an attempt to meet these kinds of psychological needs, and the psychological need is that you have competing needs for basically authenticity and attachment. And what he means by this is like attachment being like having either group belonging, or like if you're a small child and you're dependent on your parents to feed you, you have secure attachment, meaning that you know your parents aren't going to abandon you or stop feeding you or something like that, or that you are, if your means of survival is linked to attachment to what, like a job or some kind of social in-group, or you survive because you are a member of society, then that is all based on your attachment need. Versus authenticity is kind of like there's this competing kind of survival need for authenticity, which is like if you were in the jungle and you see a predator, then you have to alert your little tribal group that there's a predator there and that there's a threat to your life, right? There's their authenticity at this real kind of jungle survival level, right? Where if you think about how so many animals have things like camouflage, right? Like the way that a zebra has these stripes makes it so that it can hide in the grass and a predator doesn't see it. And similarly, certain hunting predators could have these ability to hide and disguise themselves. And authenticity is the ability to pick out a threat or a danger amongst possible things which are hiding, right? Or that there's an ability to convey this information, being like there's a real danger that we need to respond to, right? And Gabor Mate says that like oftentimes we have our body is constantly trying to give us signals about that something may be off, that something may be wrong, but we don't have any way of communicating this, because if we do that, it may threaten our attachment, right? So that we need to basically suppress our authenticity for the sake of attachment, and this ends up creating a situation that things seem kind of phony and inauthentic or something like that. Now, the thing is, when I made a video about this before, I actually decided more recently to hide this video because I was also responding to some stuff to do with my social life, which I found emotionally triggering. And there's something about getting into this which I felt like I was just being kind of like overly sensitive and emotional and moody and stuff like that. And I just figured, I don't know, I figured I'd take it down, right? But I was comparing this Gabor Mate thing about authenticity with Byung Chul Han. I think some guy in my comment section was trying to correct my pronunciation, but is it Han or Han? I don't know, right? But anyways, Byung Chul Han is not a doctor, he's a philosopher, right? And there's this whole other issue around authenticity if you approach it from the perspective of philosophy, right? And this goes all the way back to like Kant and Descartes. And for example, Rene Descartes had this example of like, do we trust our senses, right? Like, do we trust that the real world, or the normal everyday world that we experience as at face value, do we trust that our senses are delivering to us reliable information about the real nature of the world around us? Or what if we are being tricked by some demon and the whole thing is just an illusion, right? And this creates a sort of like dualism between the world as it appears to be versus some sort of hidden, transcendent truth of the true nature of things that we are separate from, right? And there's a certain kind of dualism that shows up also in religious themes, such as the fall from the Garden of Eden, where basically Adam and Eve live in paradise, and it's only until they eat the fruit from the tree and they basically learn to differentiate between good and evil, to make this distinction between good and bad, that they begin to see the world through the eyes of distinction, through the eyes of, and they begin to see the world clouded by this distinction of preferences, where instead of seeing the world as it is, we see the world clouded by this whole systems of good and bad, like and dislike, good and evil, all this kind of stuff. There's this kind of thing too, but with Gnosticism, there's this Gnosticism, like Gnostic Christianity takes the whole thing a step further and says that even, that there may be some transcendent truth that is so transcendent, it's so far removed from the material or the manifestation, that the whole world around you, even the religion, is really, like, in order to understand, like, there's a certain style of Gnostic Christianity which says in order to find the truth of religion, that there's some esoteric kernel that's hidden in religion itself, that if you understand this kernel, you see that most of religion itself is actually false, and that there's some kind of thing where the God who religion teaches you to love is really just a demiurge who has created an imperfect world full of suffering and pain and difficulty, when there is really some sort of more pure version of God that is transcendent. But obviously, since this world is so imperfect and impure and fallen, it's like this sort of transcendent goodness is so far away from the manifestation that we live in, that it's like it's basically like to say that what we experience as our everyday reality is like Neo in the Matrix. It's some sort of simulation. It's some kind of illusion. It's some kind of false reality, basically, right? And there's a kind of a mystical transcendence which puts this sort of higher truth as some kind of lofty ideal, which is forever removed from the immanent world that which we inhabit. There's a certain version of Christianity which is like this too, which says that God was there when he created the world, but if God was there while human beings were alive, we couldn't be able to handle the raw creative power of God, so God has to retreat and go into hiding to let human beings play out their human drama and all this kind of stuff. So there's a kind of this mystical thing, right? So the question is, where do I get this a Venus retrograde and a sextile to Jupiter and Gemini and all this kind of stuff? There's this basic issue around all this with, I'm going to highlight more of the Jupiter and Gemini, in that Gemini is a sign ruled by Mercury, right? Where Mercury is known to be the trickster, right? There's something about the trickster archetype where the trickster knows that it's not the appearance, that the world is full of masks, full of appearances. So, there's like the clown wears a mask, the clown wears makeup. There's this sort of thing about if you were putting on an act like a stage play, where you are playing the role of a character, where you have to, people who are all doing this thing, we have to go through this process of suspension of disbelief, where we believe the actors are really these characters, or that we allow the clown to like put on a character play for the sake of making a point or something like that, right? There's been this sort of thing about populism, populist politics with Donald Trump and the like, where they had been described to be like clowns and jesters in some way, where rather than approaching the situation like a serious politician would, they make a play out of it, right? They're putting on a little show, they're making a joke of it, kind of thing. for all these other things where we would have taken seriously, it's just a kind of a funny game, a kind of a funny joke, which goes to say there's some kind of thing where people have lost faith in taking the political world seriously at face value, and in a kind of rebellion, they've elected a bunch of clowns, a bunch of jokers to sort of sling mud at the whole process because they don't take it seriously, right? And similarly, there's this whole thing going on where I find it kind of concerning. It's now been normalized to have these powerful figures doing Nazi salutes, right? But it can still, there's this whole kind of thing where it's like, if you take it at face value, that a Nazi salute is a display of fascism, and that a threat of annexation is a kind of a fascist play in some way. Well, the thing is, what I have to say too is that around the whole political thing is that if you take the real fascists, like Hitler and Mussolini as an example, the real fascists didn't give people a whole month to prepare for a trade war, or didn't use a threat of annexation to like bully and tease and leverage a certain political play. Rather, the real Nazis built up their military in a way that they could do the blitzkrieg surprise attack and roll over the Rhineland without giving their enemy time to prepare so as to catch them off guard, right? So there's something about, I tend to consider the current state of affairs with Donald Trump and fascism to be a kind of a micro-fascist, where kind of, at this stage anyways, we haven't entered into full-on fascism yet, but there's something about the sort of like the two-facedness of the Gemini trickster, where you see also, like, Elon Musk with this black edgelord MAGA hat, dark MAGA hat and the sunglasses. It's sort of like the idea is that, is this a mask? Is this a costume? Is there some other play or strategy that's hiding behind the appearance, right? There's also, if you think about like what's going on with other famous people such as Mark Zuckerberg, the person who obviously owns Facebook, he's recently undergone a kind of a makeover, right? This could be, if I was taking a more simplistic approach to doing this Venus retrograde video, maybe I would suggest that Venus retrograde, it could be time for a makeover, for a time to redo your aesthetics or something like that, right? And you could take a look at recent people like Mark Zuckerberg, who has recently changed his style, his way of displaying himself publicly, and has sort of rebranded himself in a way to make himself more friendly to this kind of like Joe Rogan, MAGA, masculine, manosphere kind of culture. But what I've noticed is that the people who situate themselves in that culture, who make themselves home in that kind of position, seem to judge this suspiciously, where they doubt whether or not this appearance, this kind of rebranding, this kind of change of style is authentic, whether he really means it, or if this is simply just a play to sort of adapt to the current power center, basically. That if there's the power center if the power center is being built off of this sort of affirmation of, let's say, conservatism or traditionalism rather than progressive politics, you look at people like the tech oligarchs, the people who own the social media platforms, there's this question of what do they really believe. What do they really mean? What are their true, authentic intentions versus what is the way that what are their optics? How do they make themselves look? How do they present themselves? What do they try to appeal to, right? And there is a kind of, especially with Mark Zuckerberg, I feel that there's a certain suspicion that this is only skin deep, or this is just a shallow play to sort of win support or win favor of where the what is taken to be the center, the political, where all the political power lies, and to sort of win favors with the current administration, and to secure your own position of power within this political context, this political environment, right? And so there's a sort of thing where we sort of like with Gemini, there's a sense of, I think a lot of this goes with this Jupiter Gemini transit, because there's a certain kind of sense with Gemini that you expect that the face that they're showing is not the only face, not the only side of the story, basically, right? That there could be just one appearance that's being offered, but that appearance is itself kind of fake, kind of phony, or kind of like a play, right? And that there's a kind of, but even the leader is sort of kind of like a jester or a clown in this sense, right? There's an underlying thing as well, where recently I've been getting more interested in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, and one of the things that I have to admit that is one of these things where I think I've probably had a certain kind of resonance with Nietzsche for a long time, but because Nietzsche is famous for succumbing to madness and is sort of, I don't know, he's kind of unhinged and angsty, I would say, that there's something about it where I kind of, early on, I kind of felt that, I don't think getting really up on my Nietzschean philosophy would necessarily do me any good if my goal was basically to be sane and stable or whatever, right? But nonetheless, it sort of has been a kind of, over the last decade or so, a period of procrastinating and holding off reading Nietzsche, and more recently I've finally given in and I'm finally getting into it. And there's a certain issue where Nietzsche gets right into this whole problem about authenticity in terms of, or the idea of the trickster or the deceiver, and that saying that in terms of, there's a certain idea of like the political context where there's this idea of like, it makes a lot of sense if you think about the idea of Trump and post-truth, right? Or there's idea of like that in order for us to be functional in a coherent way, you need to have a certain basic established kind of truth that we all operate on, in the sense that like if I ask you to pass the pepper grinder and instead you pass me a trumpet, or you pass me I don't know, what's another example? You pass me a telephone, and I say, no, I don't need a telephone, I need a pepper grinder to put pepper on my food. And every time I use this word to represent this object, and when I say this, you seem like you don't know what a pepper grinder is, because, we need to have some established reality where this word means this thing, or that we have, like, when it comes to, like, financial matters, we have to have some basic agreement that if we have a system of debts and payments, that like you don't want to go and like settle a debt with somebody. But how much do you owe? I owe this amount of money, and you pay them off, and then you go the next day and they're like, oh, so you still owe me? And you're like, no, I paid you yesterday. No, you didn't. No, we have to actually agree on the reality, because if you start to do this thing where you're like where the whatever is in the accounting is just whatever you make it up to be, whatever the numbers mean, or just whatever you make it up to be, or like there is no objective truth. It's just people. It's just who you can just bully the other person into whatever's true or whatever is real. You have a bit of a problem there, right? But Nietzsche was saying that if you look at this from the position of power, that there is so many instances when lying, deceiving, using tricks, not being authentic may be useful and advantageous in a power play or in a political situation, right? And that if we are if so it's like kind of thing is, what's your goal here? Is your goal to preserve this kind of immaculate kind of objective truth, that we have this coherent kind of objective truth where we all know what words mean, we all know what math means, we all agree on a certain consensus reality, right? We all kind of agree that there's a consensus reality, and when all our communication operates off this shared reality that we all agreed on, and so the most important thing is maintaining the integrity or the coherence or the rationality of this true reality that we all share, versus that being something which is more flexible, that you could lie, you could cheat, you could fib, you could construe myths, and stories, and you could do all this not for the preservation of some immaculate, true, objective reality which makes everything coherent and legible, but rather that you would be willing to lie, cheat, and steal and do what it takes to maintain power or gain power or do this, and then from a position, and it's really from this position of power that we dictate what is real and what is true, rather than it being some objective truth that we all rely on. And in this sense, that the fact that we can kind of just like say that there's this idea that, like, for example, if we have to ask, why are we being hit with these big trade tariffs? And they say, oh, it's because we have such a big like drug problem, right? Because Canada we're just, for a long time, we've just been real slackers about our border. We have this big drug problem, and there's a lot of drug dealers or criminals in Canada that are making lots of money off of selling drugs to America. And you're like, okay, well, what's our data? What's our numbers? Like, why don't we look at what kind of drugs we seize on the border, and what if we look at the data and we actually find it's actually true the other way, that there are a lot of drugs coming into Canada from other countries, and it's not the fact that we are the one, that to be like, that truth is sort of inconvenient if we want to use tariffs. Like, the whole point is, the whole point though is that if you just, like, you need to have some sort of objective truth to make this whole, like, it's not just us strong-arming each other into trying to get what we want. We're actually dealing with reality here, right? But the thing, what's kind of crazy is, like, what happens if you elect a bunch of politicians that don't value objective reality. Instead, they value power. They put lies, deception, trickery as clever strategies to gain and hold on to power over the value of having an objective truth that we all that makes everything more rational, more understandable, more coherent for all parties involved. Right? There's this kind of idea about the there's also this kind of problem too about what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, right? In that there's this idea that, like, a lot of people are talking about what's going to happen with the trade war, in that rather than using this power of lies and trickery and all this kind of stuff to gain power and to hold on to power. Well, I mean, I guess you could say that is kind of the plan, but that the plan is basically to disrupt and destabilize the whole global economy, so that it's like a shock, where you made all your plans assuming these certain circumstances were going to be the case, and now all these things that we take for granted that we thought were going to be true is now held in, what if it's not true? Right? What if it's all up, what if all the things that we were making plans based on the assumption that we could rely on this things being the case, but now we don't know everything is up for grabs, right? It's kind of interesting because I was listening to an interview a while back about H.G. Wells and Orson Welles, and they were talking about the War of the Worlds, and H.G. Wells in this interview was talking about the what sounds like a shock doctrine, right? And he was basically saying that, like, they were talking about being in the middle of World War II and all this kind of stuff, but he was basically saying that, like, the shocks that we undergo as a society, as a civilization, serve some positive benefit in terms of reinforcing rationality, right? And the idea is that in a world gone crazy, in a world gone insane, then it's the ones who are able to come out of this with a greater sense of rationality, a greater sense of reality, so that it's really just a kind of a shaking off the dead weight, right? Or like, but it's kind of, it's sort of, it makes this sort of assumption. Even H.G. Wells kind of makes this sort of assumption that the whole process is a evolution. It's kind of like there's a sort of evolution towards more rational, more sensible, more intelligent ways of living and organizing society. But before things get better, they have to get worse, right? And that the idea, there's sort of, I'll put the link to this in my comments or whatever, in my notes and references. But there's this idea that there are all the trials and troubles that we face as a civilization is going to be this thing where if it works, it gets reinforced, right? The things that work get built up, get reinforced, get strengthened because they work well, and the things that don't work are going to be subject to breaking down, right? The things that don't work are going to go into the recycling bin, going to go into the compost heap, and all get recycled back into it. And so, like this, but there's a sort of underlying bias here, I think, especially when you factor in the culture war, in that there's a sort of underlying mentality I find that tends to, it's like why people like Nick Land, a certain type of, there's a certain strain of postmodern, or whatever you would say, right? These accelerationists that go in this right-wing direction, because there is a sort of like, if everything goes to shit, if everything goes crazy, then there's some sort of like, a lot of people think that what is going to get them through this to the other side is falling back. This is like to retreat back to the structures of tradition, right? Being that the male is the strong one with the muscles who does the work, and the female takes care of housework and female so there's this idea that the traditional gender norms are like some kind of a program or some kind of a machine which is been designed to be resilient to the stresses and the uncertainties of the changes of life, and that there's some kind of fear about progressivism in that the whole, like, and this could be LGBTQ stuff, this could be disability stuff, but this I relate to this as a guy who's on PWD, who's on disability, and being seen as like, this is the kind of thing where we want to have a strong society of these family units which can support themselves, and that if you are weak and feeble and you need disability payments and all this kind of stuff, we are going to create this whole economic pressure so that like all the weak and feeble people will just get killed off in a wave of destruction, and then the people that survive will be these like super muscular Chad types and their traditional wives, and this will be like the unit which is designed to survive this crazy shakeup, and then once they get to the side, it will just reconfirm that they were right all along, that they're the traditional family values of gender coding, that women do this, men do this, we're there for a reason, and all the trans people will just like go crazy and kill themselves, or else we get killed off in waves of violence or something like that. And it just goes to show that the traditional gender norms were there for a reason all along. And this is mainly because, the men with the big muscles, like even if it just comes down to sheer violence, it'll be like and this is why it gets kind of fucked, because if the only way that you can prove that a certain way of living is better is to just basically resort to war and violence and be like, if we're better at killing you, that gives us the right to deserve to survive, and you just deserve to lose and die. And that this is a kind of a Darwinian style of evolution. And this is funny because if you listen to, like, there's a book here that I got, it's very interesting, which is Can We Believe in People by Stephen R.L. Clarke. And a lot of what I find interesting about this book is that it's a critique of this sort of social Darwin style kind of survival of the fittest mentality, right? And that says that there are that the civilization that we're gonna intentionally, instead of creating a world that is better for everybody, we are intentionally going to create circumstances that are difficult so that only the strong survive, and as a trial, right? But it's not just like what. There's some kind of sense that, like, what is this supposed to do is sort of reinforce rationality, intelligence, all this kind of stuff. But if you're right out the bat, you are entering into this by creating a chaotic, uncertain situation by basically where all these things where we would previously rely on a consensus of what reality is now undermined, where, the reason why we're going to have a trade war is because we deserve it. Because, if we were good people, we wouldn't, our trade, we wouldn't rely, our wealth and prosperity wouldn't be based on being criminals, drug dealers, selling fentanyl. All these poor addicts in America who are addicted to fentanyl, it's because of us criminal mastermind Canadians who we're just lining our pockets with all this drug money. And all of these Canadians, there's these Americans that are just, they can't work, they're addicted, they're useless, and Donald Trump is probably going to have to throw them in a gas chamber and kill them to purify the American civilization. And it's all because of this corruption that's coming from Canada, because we don't value things like meritocracy. We don't value hard work. We don't value being strong and intelligent. We value we are a bunch of criminal drug dealers who are basically out to corrupt American society, and we're just going to keep doing it unless Donald Trump annexes us, right? And in my own situation, I'm on this medication that's provided to me from socialized healthcare, from public healthcare system, meaning that if I wasn't in Canada, or if Canada didn't have public healthcare, and I had to I have these little I wonder if I have one around. Yeah, I have a receipt, right? I have a receipt from, I'm not gonna, I don't know, I'm not gonna, maybe you'll get identity theft if I put this up to the camera, right? But it says that for every one of these infusions that I get, on every 2 months, the government pays $2,215, right? So that if I was an American, I would have to have a healthcare insurance provider pay out $2,000 for this medication every 2 months, right? And so if the Americans come and annex us and they take away our public health care, are we gonna negotiate with them so that all the Canadians who we're getting payouts of over $2,000 every month for our medical insurance based on the public healthcare system? Are we gonna get grandfathered into this so that the American healthcare system just so we don't have or what? You're gonna what do you want me to do to make an extra $1,000 a month to pay for this medical treatment, right? Or else do I have the option to go off this medical treatment? Because I don't even know if I really want to be on it, to be honest, right? But it's because these doctors tell me, because of their established medical opinion, that I need to be on it, or else I'm just gonna die, right? So the whole question is if you are you gonna come and invade Canada, take all these people off of their public health care, and then just see if they die or not, right? And this is kind of interesting because this is sort of it's just kind of interesting to consider that based on the politics, this is one potential outcome. This was one particular direction things could be going in, right? There's the other thing. I mean, okay, well, I seem to be trailing off into thought. I'll leave it at this for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Keep on rocking in the free world. Until next time, this is Dan's Astrology signing off.